Welcome back to AP World History. This is going to be Unit 1, Day 8. This is going to be Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. Remember to have out your history notebook and you're taking notes as you move through the video. And please make sure that you're completing the vocabulary for this video, which is on the next slide and down in the description. So our key terms today are going to be feudalism, the Daimyo, Shogun, samurai, Sinification, the Koguryo Dynasty, Chan Buddhism, the Trung Sisters, Bushido, and Seppuka. Key concepts are going to be the political, economic, and social characteristics of Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. And we'll talk about the characteristics of feudal Japan and the impact of Sinification. So before we get started on talking about the cultural aspects of them, let's talk about the physical characteristics, the geography of Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. Now, the physical characteristics is that in Korea and Vietnam is very mountainous, cut by river valleys. The population is located on the flatter plains areas. In Japan is a series of volcanic islands, very mountainous with deep valleys with plains. And for like demography, their principal rice is going to be their principal crop. Now, Korea, also known as the Bridge. Now, Korean history from 669 to 1392 CE is going to be the Koguryo, which conquers the Silla dynasty in 935 and ruled till 1392 as a tributary state to China. Now, China's influence on Korea, also known as Sinification, which is becoming more Chinese. Koreans borrowed what was useful and unavoidable and avoided what was not. Their tributary embassies included Korean royal officials and scholars. They would send to China. Most of their architecture in Korea is based on Chinese architecture, but they kept some of their older traditions. Ancestor worship was strong in Korean society, where it kind of waned in China and then came back. Korean officials were trained in Confucian ideas during the Han, but during the Tang Dynasty, which is prior to the Song Dynasty, they were not as strong. Newer traditions, most Korean elite turned to Neo-Confucianism. Peasants turned to Chan Buddhism, which is Chinese Buddhism. Now their differences from China is that they had royal houses and aristocracy that dominated Korea. Now, Vietnam under the Chinese rule, 983 CE, is that there's going to be a revolution led by the Trung Sisters. Now, Vietnam has a history of not liking being controlled by other people. When the Chinese attempt to conquer, they're going to rebel. When the French attempt to conquer in the 1800s, they're going to rebel. And in the 20th century, when the Americans show up, they're going to rebel again. Right? Vietnam has a history of rebellion against people who attempt to conquer them. Most peasants resented Chinese influences, especially in towns and cities. Once again, Vietnam's going to have a 1,000-year struggle for independence. But their relationship with China is going to be largely tributary, and they're also going to increase champa rice. Now, independent Vietnam from around 983, they're going to be ruled by their own dynasties. The capital moves between Hanoi and Hue. The biggest difference is from China. Is they have more of a role of the village instead of the family, like families in China. The village is in Vietnam. They're going to have few cities. Villages dominate the countrysides run by village elders. Many Vietnamese retain the religious tradition. And women played a more predominant role in Vietnam. They could be head of households, own land, engage openly in business, which is very different than in China. And women were often leaders of villages, even at national level. Now, the Chinese influence in Vietnam is limited to the elite. The higher classes adopted bureaucracy, form of empire, Confucianism from China. They adopt the Chinese scripts and literacy and artistic models. Mahayana Buddhism also arrived, even though most people in Vietnam were Theravada Buddhism. And Mahayana Buddhism is they believe Buddha's a god. Theravada means he's just a dude. Now, let's move on to Japan. Japan was very feudalistic during this time. This time period is called the Shogunate period, where military dictators, known as Shogun, uh, kind of ruled. They did have an emperor, but the emperor was kind of more just kind of figurehead. He kind of reigned in splendid isolation, where yes, he's in charge. He's the emperor, but really it was the shogun who ruled. The government was very centralized feudalism. The countryside was divided into fiefs ruled by daimyos, who were like just like lords and vassals. This is going to be shoguns and daimyos. They're basically going to be like the governors. They adopted Neo-Confucian ideologies for state-running government. Right, provincial lords control Japan. These are daimyos. They're going to fight against each other. And then these daimyos who have different parts of Japan are going to separate those parts into littler parts which are controlled by samurai. And those samurai are in constant war within themselves and the daimyos to increase personal power, wealth, gain land and fiefs. Right? So it's very much a chaotic time where there's constant warfare and fighting to gain power and influence. Now, the samurai are going to be the lowest form of aristocratic nobility. They're going to observe a code of honor known as Bushido. Right? And that means that if your honor is sullied in any way, you must either defend it with your life or engage in a ritualistic suicide called seppuku in order to preserve your honor. Now, Japanese women under Heian were the cultural elite with elaborate rituals, including dress. They had influence, including several empresses, which is very different than China. Under the shogunate, they lost considerable influence as Neo-Confucianism introduced, which is going to make them more patriarchal, and warfare begins to spread. Women could still be samurai and fight, but they were more of a patriarchal system. There is several instances of extremely influential female samurai that will defend and kill hundreds, if not thousands, of samurai on their own. Right? So again, we have two forms of ritualistic suicide in order to preserve your honor. We had seppuku, which is a more drawn out and long, and you celebrate life, and you read poetry, and you have food, and you visit with the family, and then you basically you slice open your stomach with a knife, and if you show any hesitation, that's the gentleman who will also remove your head. And then you have harakiri, which is a more rushed form where you use your ceremonial katana and do the same thing. Again, that's going to end our for today. Remember to make sure that you are following along with your notes, and at the same time you're also completing the vocabulary, which is at the beginning of the video and down in the description. Thank you guys, and I'll see you guys in class.